I am going to talk a bit about using the Web Archive interface itself and actually getting data out of it. However, I'm actually going to take us a little bit further back and actually examine some of the themes that Richard has touched on and amplify them a little bit about why it is we're doing this, how it gets done, who does it, and what the implications of all that are. And so, picking up on the point from Jill Lepore that Richard's just drawn to, there is this sense in the public at large that the web is, as it were, its own archive. That's to say that stuff, particularly the stuff that you don't want to hang around, will indeed hang around, and so in a sense there isn't any particular point to web archiving because it does the job itself. I think I'd want to challenge that using this piece of research by a former colleague of mine here at the library, Andy Jackson, who took a look at they went back through all of the individual resources that the UK Web Archive had captured over what was a 9-year period, and checked and asked, where are they now? That's to say, were they still where they were, and if they were, had they changed? And so if you have a look at this, in the very, very top left-hand corner, the darker blue segment, that tells you that of the resources that were first captured in 2004, almost none of them, maybe a fraction of a percent, almost none of them were in the same place as they were in 2004 and unchanged at the same time. Looking again on the far left axis, another, say, 12% of the material that had been there in 2004 was in the same place and was quite similar. Only a very small proportion, was similar. Some of it was there, but quite dissimilar. The biggest segment that you see there, the white, is actually nearly 60% or so was missing. That is to say, no longer to be found at the same URL, and then about nearly 30% of it was missing, and Andy and his colleagues were sure that it was permanently missing. So this tells you, I think, that actually the web really isn't its own archive at all. And looking on the far right-hand side, even from material that had been archived less than a year beforehand, still only about 20% of it was in the same place and still the same. So the rate of decay and change on the live web is really quite significant, and I would actually go so far as to say that actually this probably underestimates the effect, because much of the material that's in the selective UK Web Archive is actually matters of public record, institutional material, which I think actually has, in general, is more likely to hang around. So I can't establish that, but that's my hunch. So it might be that the effect on the web as a whole is even more marked than this. And so stuff disappears, but it disappears in different ways. Here's David Cameron's campaign, a general election campaign site for the Witney constituency in 2005. Doesn't he look young? That's what power does to you. And clearly this is content that had an established shelf life. It was launched at the beginning of the campaign, and on the day of the general election, along with a number of thousand other individual campaign websites, all disappeared. This screenshot here is from the copy in the UK Web Archive, because the British Library and partners were quite assiduous in getting after general election campaigns from the very early days of the archive. However, stuff also disappears in an unpredictable way. If you remember the sudden collapse of the News of the World a year or two ago, one day it was there with all of its content, and the following day, all that was available via their domain name was this image, in effect. And so stuff disappears and changes on the web in a much more unpredictable way as well. However, it was also, the News of the World hasn't quite gone. Here is the and representation of all of the content for it from the Internet Archive. And you see that this is just for the homepage, newsoftheworld.co.uk. You see that it's been saved nearly 8,500 times over a 16-year period. And including in more recent times, see there from 2011, 2012, and the graph, actually that's been almost daily copies of the same unchanging homepage. Richard's talked a little bit about why anyone should care about any of this. I think most of us here would see, I think, the impetus that's behind web archiving in relation to what it enables in terms of future education and research. And I won't go into that particular. I think it'll become more apparent as the day goes on. But there are other elements to this in a national context. One of the most established use cases that the web archiving community know about is actually for archived web material that then stands up in court as evidence of something that was previously stated or shown or published online, which has subsequently disappeared. And so that's part of it. But there is also a more general issue of public accountability. That's to say, if individuals and organisations are going to publish things and make statements, then actually there needs to be some way of establishing that that has been the case in the broader sense. And so I apologise for another political example, but here it is. You may remember at the back end of 2011 there was a little social media storm about an apparent the disappearance of a back archive of speeches made by Conservative ministers. This I would be fairly sure was actually an administrative tidying up exercise by the Conservatives.com webmaster, that he or she wanted to take material and put them on a slightly different server so it wasn't so prominent in search results. And the way that he or she did it had the effect, probably unintentional, of making sure that the Internet Archive blocked access to all of the back catalogue as well. And so there was a social media storm, Conservatives airbrush history, and so on and so on and so forth. Here's Polly Toynbee on Twitter, after a helpful person had pointed out that the site had been and was continuing to be captured in the UK Web Archive as well. And so here is one of the speeches that has subsequently disappeared. This is David Cameron in 2009 on One World Conservatism and the foreign aid budget. So I'm going to give you a brief roundup of who it is does this on in worldwide scale, and why it is, what the different set of motivations and drivers behind that are. As we mentioned already, the Wayback Machine provided by the Internet Archive is where it all began. They began work in 1996. They reckon they've captured 456 billion individual pages, broadly defined, which is an awful lot of content. And the prime way of getting into it is a search for an individual URL, and we'll talk about that as one means of accessing this content a little bit later on. And as Richard said, they're based in San Francisco. And really, the worldwide community, I think, owes a great debt of gratitude to Brewster Kaler and his team for having set all this up on a non-profit basis, on an individual initiative. I've talked about the Internet Archive. Possibly the main players within the worldwide scene are actually the national libraries and national archives. The International Internet Preservation Consortium has, I think, 50 members, unless we've had any more join in the past 6 months or so. And of those, the vast majority of them are national libraries or national archives. And it's quite European heavy at the minute, but with quite a lot of North American representation. That isn't all, however. There are all sorts of permutations of local, regional and subject-specific libraries and archives who do web archiving in relation to their own content drivers. And so in the Australian context, all the state libraries, that's analogous to the counties in this country, of course, are all involved in the scene. There are also quite a lot of university libraries, fewer in this country but more overseas, who are involved in this. In the Danish context, actually one of the university libraries is a prime partner with the National Library in the domain-wide, the non-print legal deposit activities that go on there, covering the whole of the .dk domain. And then there are also individual galleries, individual archives and museums, and not least, and this is where also individuals, as to say individual researchers, individual campaigners, journalists, and all sorts of individuals who have an interest in saving a record of content online that's of use to them. And so there are all sorts of different ways and means of doing this, both at the scale that the Internet Archive and the British Library operate, but also on a DIY basis, tools and options that can be deployed on your own machine to do basic web archiving for your own purposes. So this happens at both very, very large and very, very small scales. So on those scales, how do they do it? There is a cluster of technologies which we will talk about a bit today as we go on. Heritrix is the standard web. Well, is it standard? Yes, it probably is. One of the parts of the market leading web crawler, the software that enables the actual capture of web content. Wayback is the software which allows the replay of that content in a browser. And then there are various other technologies which allow the searching and indexing and retrieval of that content, namely CDX and Solar, which we'll talk about a bit later on. On the smaller scale, tools that you can actually deploy locally, individually, are HT-Track, which I myself don't use, but it is actually quite user-friendly, has a user interface, can be deployed on your own machine. If you are slightly more comfortable on the command line on your machine, there is a utility called wget, which does much the same job. And there are also various options for archiving web pages as PDFs, which is another strand of activity in this whole space. It is also possible to get other people to do it for you once you've decided what it is you want archived. Quite a lot of organizations use services such as Archive.it, which is provided by the Internet Archive, or Archive the Net, which is provided by the Internet Memory Foundation, based in Amsterdam and Paris. And so there are outsourcing options for organizations with the budget to do it and who aren't inclined to set up the infrastructure themselves. And as we go on, there is a standard, an ISO standard file format, which is pretty universally adopted as the standard way of capturing this material for storage and retrieval. And so that, as in digital preservation terms, that's actually quite unusual to have a standardized approach on a global basis. So actually, in that sense, the web archiving community is in a good place. How is it that anyone can actually do this? Doesn't all this stuff actually belong to individuals? Isn't it all in copyright? And the answer to that, yes, is of course it is. And so there have been three broad approaches to capturing this content, which fall into these three. The first, which is how the UK Web Archive has operated at least until 2013 and still does in part, is the obtaining directly of permissions from site owners to take a copy of a site and to republish it, in effect, to make it publicly available. And this is time-consuming and costly and by no means 100% successful. Another option which is sometimes used is to tell people you're going to do it and hope they don't complain. That is to say, an opt-out, a notice and take-down approach, which has been used for content of a particular significance quite widely. And then NPLD, that is to say non-print legal deposit, which I won't talk about now because I'm sure Helen's going to pick up a bit on that in her presentation. Oh, I will define it. Yeah, okay, well, let Helen talk about non-print legal deposit. But in general terms, what we're talking about there is a nationwide dispensation for a library and archive to collect the whole or part of a national domain, backed up by primary legislation to indemnify them against all the breaches of copyright that are involved. So there are three different approaches. So I just want to talk about just some key terms because these are going to come up during the day, and it's worth getting these in mind to begin with. Used interchangeably, by and large, are the terms crawler, spider, or harvester, which is Heritrix that I was talking about before, the software which allows the actual capture of material from the live web. Two terms which are also often used synonymously are crawl and harvest, that is to say, a single operation of crawling and getting hold of material online. So this might be a domain crawl, that's to say a whole sweep of a whole nation's domain, or actually a crawl or a harvest of a single site. So it can be used at both levels. Seed and target are quite close to each other. A seed is, so if you think of the web as, there's content at all sorts of hierarchical levels on the web. There are home pages for whole individual sites, there are individual PDFs, individual media items. Where it is that you start your crawl depends very much on where you think what is most important in terms of the content you want to acquire. And the seed is just the URL starting point that you use. And a target, which is partly a BL term but usually used more widely, is all of the information that relates to an individual seed. So all of the data that describes the seed and why it's significant. And not quite synonymous, but near enough for today, a gatherer and an instance being individual snapshots of your seed. That's to say, and so in an archiving context, you'll have a single seed, bl.uk, but you'll have many gathers or many instances of it timed over a time. And it's worth just spelling out here that actually the Wayback Machine is not Wayback. This is quite important. The Wayback Machine is the Internet Archive's service that you can access at archive.org. Wayback is a software that allows the replay of archived web content, which is widely deployed in many web archives internationally. It's confused by the fact that
we use Open Wayback, so it's slightly
Indeed. But Wayback was first made by the Internet Archive to service the Wayback Machine, hence the confusion. It's worth watching this one because it does confuse people as we go. I just wanted to pick out some of the ways in which users have historically and are beginning to use the archived web. So there are various different ways in, different use cases, different modes. The first one is the URL search. That's to say, you come to a Web Archives interface and you know what it is you're looking for. You know that the URL of the thing you want to find historic copies of. You search for it, and then once you found it, you go and browse an individual page. You go and look at an individual page as an artifact, a little bit like your manuscript. The second way into this is actually a full text search. That's to say, searching an index of all of the text within all of the archive web content, again, heading towards a single page. So by no means all of the web archives internationally enable this. This is partly because it's not technically straightforward to enable, to index and and provide indexes that work for large amounts of data. So the reason the Internet Archive don't do this is simply that they have far too much data. And actually the index wouldn't stand up. It couldn't be made to work. Following on from full text search results, users then tend to go to single pages to see them, in other words, to go and look at the content. So those are the classic use cases, as it were. Things are starting to open out a bit in terms of visualizations of trends across larger corpora of material. That's to say, visualizing how the content looks at a macro level. If I just look briefly at the full text search and filter options, and I'll come back to visualizations. This is the prototype which we're going to be looking at during the day today. The British Library's Shine interface, and the URL is at the bottom there. And so full text searching accompanied with filtering by individual facets. So here what you have is an option to search the full text of something for particular terms, to search them by proximity, that's to say find term A within X number of characters of term B, and also to exclude from your results instances of other terms. So find me this and that, but not that. In a web archive context, as we find as the day goes on, this actually still produces a great deal. Even the most refined query comes up with an awful lot of results. We're talking about a lot of data here. And so actually there is a need then to filter those results by the characteristics of the resources that you're looking at. So I might want to search for term X and term Y, but not term Z, but only in material that was captured in a particular date range, as you see in the bottom half there. Or material that was held by a particular host, a particular site, or a particular domain, or by public suffix, that's to say everything in the .ac.uk domain, or the .gov.uk second level domain, or material that's delivered in PDF, or just image files, and so on and so forth. So what you have is a paradigm where you have a full text search accompanied by a filtering of results by type. That's good. So that will be, I think, fairly familiar to you from library management systems around. The visualization, I don't want to spend too long on this because Josh is going to tell us quite a lot more and more interesting than mine a little bit later on. But here's just one example of, I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with the Google Ngram. It's a way of representing the incidence of terms over time in a particular, in a corpus of data. And so here we are. This on the left-hand side, you see this is an axis representing the percentage of resources in the archive captured in a particular year that contain a particular string of characters. And so this is a graphing of the terms big data and digital humanities. And as you might see, both of them actually both come into kind of, and there's a kind of a, I wouldn't say they were related, but there is a coincidence that the curves pick up at around about the same point and continue to rise. So that's just a very, very simple example, but there'll be much more on that as we go. There are, however, 3 other use cases which I just want to draw some attention to, which are up and coming, but I think will grow over time. There is a small but a very dedicated group of web archive researchers who want direct access to the data itself. They're not interested in user interfaces online. What they want is to be able to download WARC files and take them home and to replay and to interrogate them themselves. There is also, the last one, there is also quite a lot of interest growing, I think, in having API, Advanced Programming Interface, access to Web Archive content as well. That is to say, to allow technically adept researchers to build effectively their own user interfaces for things. And finally, which I'm going to pick up on now, also data about the data. That's to say, data sets derived from larger web archiving collections, which can be a research data in its own right. Much of what we're talking about today is based on the JISC UK web domain dataset, which is a copy of everything that the Internet Archive archived for the .uk domain from 1996 to 2013, in fact. But these datasets I'm talking about go to 2010, and so most of what we're talking about today will be based on this. And there are available in the public domain at that URL at the bottom there 4 derived datasets from that larger one. One of them is a file format profile. That's to say, effectively an indexing of all the individual file formats within the archive, which is from a digital preservation point of view is quite big news. There is also a geo-index. That's to say, an indexing of the incidence of UK postcodes. Postcodes are quite easy to do in this regard because they have a standard format and can't very easily be confused with anything else. There is a crawled URL index, that's to say the CDX. The CDX is as it were, a lookup file for which URLs are held in which WARC files, because each individual WARC file will have many URLs in it. This provides you, in effect, quite a useful lookup for that. Finally, there is the host link graph, which I myself use quite extensively, which is a mapping of which hosts linked to which other hosts at certain times in the archives. And so that, for instance, that's 2 billion, just north of 2 billion individual lines, which you can download in a TSV file. There isn't an application you can use to open it, so what you need to be reasonably adept on the command line, but not very adept to use it. And it unzips to about 200 gigabytes on your hard drive, so leave plenty of space. Here is an analysis, again done by staff here at the library, using the file format profile, which tells you that in 1996, nearly 3/4 of the UK web was written in HTML 2.0, one of the first stable versions of HTML in which most of the web is delivered. But it also tells you that by 2005, HTML 2.0 was dead by and large. There was almost no content still in it. And by 2010, a similar proportion, that's to say nearly 3/4 of the UK web, was delivered in a successor version, XHTML 1.0. So this looks a bit wonky, and this is a bit digital preservation heavy, but it's a kind of analysis you can start to do at a macro level across all of the data.